In the secluded uplands of East Texas, where the towering pine woods fade into endless open plains, there once existed a chain of encampments that promised redemption to the damned. From 1845 until 1881, more than 300 souls passed through these places of supposed salvation, desperate to wash away their sins. Only a few ever returned. Those who survived spoke in hushed, trembling tones of purification rituals so extreme that death itself seemed merciful. When federal agents finally stormed these sites in 1881, they unearthed something far more horrifying than blind religious zealotry. A hidden burial ground containing the bodies of nearly 200 victims, each bearing unmistakable marks of prolonged torture. But what lay recorded in the private ledgers of the Damnation family would shatter the core of frontier law and reveal a criminal machine so intricate it had thrived for over 30 years without discovery. Tonight, we reveal the full account of the most prolific serial killers in American frontier history and the twisted redemption they promised. The desperate and the damned, before delving into the saga of the Damnation family and their bloody rule disguised as salvation. Consider this. This isn't a story for everyone, only for those unafraid to confront the bleakest chapters of America's past. If you're among the few who can face it, subscribe and share where you're listening from. What follows may alter everything you believed about faith, justice, and the cost of redemption in the wilderness of the American frontier. The year was 1845. Texas had just joined the Union as the 28th state after nearly 10 years as its own republic. The frontier stretched as a vast and unforgiving wilderness, where broken souls fled from their pasts, seeking either grace or destruction. It was a place where a man's word held more weight than any law, where justice was often tied to the end of a rope, and where religious fervor burned hotter than the August sun. Along the dusty roads threading sparse settlements scattered over endless miles, whispers began to circulate about three brothers who promised something priceless to sinners: immediate salvation through pain of the flesh. The Damnation brothers, preacher Malachi, evangelist Cornelius, and prophet Jebediah, had come to Texas from Arkansas at the start of 1845. They carried letters of recommendation from numerous Baptist and Methodist congregations across the South. Malachi Damnation, the eldest, stood 6 feet tall with piercing gray eyes that seemed to reach straight into a man's soul. His black hair was always groomed to perfection, and his voice held an eerie, magnetic quality, capable of bringing hardened outlaws to tears. At 35, he was the most commanding of the three, capable of preaching with a force that left entire crowds suspended between fear and rapture. Cornelius, 2 years younger, had a talent that unsettled everyone. He could read guilt as if it were written across a face. His uncanny ability to name a man's hidden sins convinced many that he was touched by the supernatural. His gaunt frame and hollowed cheeks only amplified his image as a vessel of divine insight. Cornelius specialized in what the brothers referred to as confession extraction, dragging out the darkest secrets from their followers. The youngest, Jebediah, called himself a prophet and claimed to receive visions straight from heaven. At 28, his body was built like a blacksmith's, with massive hands he said were blessed for healing. His task was to oversee the physical purification, ensuring that each penitent suffered exactly as much as their sins supposedly required. Together, the brothers constructed a chain of redemption camps deep within East Texas, where the cypress swamps bled into pine forest and civilization felt a lifetime away. From the outside, the camps appeared ordinary: rings of canvas tents arranged in perfect circles, wooden crosses looming overhead, and a central fire pit where the brothers roared their sermons to flocks of the desperate. Their followers came from every shadow of frontier life: cowboys running from cattle theft charges, prostitutes escaping cruel brothel owners, gamblers crushed beneath debts, murderers evading vigilantes, and deserters from both the Mexican War and various Indian conflicts. But the camps also drew a surprising number of seemingly respectable figures: crooked merchants, disgraced politicians, and even sincere spiritual seekers who had heard rumors of the brothers' miraculous transformations. The Damnation brothers preached a merciless gospel that echoed the brutal spirit of the frontier. Sin must be burned away like chaff in the fire, Malachi would bellow, his voice reverberating through the pines as the flames flickered across his angular face. The body must suffer so the soul can soar. There is no easy road to paradise, only the narrow, blazing path of pain. Their fame spread rapidly throughout Texas and beyond. In newspapers across the frontier, testimonials appeared from supposed penitents who claimed to have left the camps reborn. Once cruel men, now humbled and gentle. Sinners remade into saints, ready to carry the gospel into the wild. But in the late summer of 1847, the first dark cracks in the legend began to appear. A cattle driver named Samuel Hartwell stumbled into the town of Marshall, Texas, barely alive, muttering about what he had witnessed at one of the redemption camps near the strange, still waters of Cato Lake. Those who recognized Hartwell were shocked. Once a sturdy, broad-shouldered man in his 30s, he was now skeletal and frail, his hair entirely white. His hands trembled without pause, and he flinched at the faintest sound. His eyes, once a clear, bright blue, were hollow, stripped of warmth, as though he had stared into something unspeakable. His story came in broken fragments, interrupted by long, empty silences where he seemed to slip away from reality. The town's pastor, William Matthews, took him in. Each night Hartwell awoke screaming about the pit of purification and the screaming that never ends. In calmer moments, he recounted how he'd come to the camp seeking forgiveness for killing a man during a drunken card game. "They told me pain would save me," he whispered to Pastor Matthews. Brother Malachi looked into my eyes and laid bare everything I'd ever done. Not just the killing. He knew about the money I stole from my mother back in Arkansas. He knew about the woman I left pregnant in New Orleans. He knew every sin I'd ever kept hidden. According to Hartwell, the so-called purification began as soon as newcomers arrived. Their belongings were stripped away, including their clothes, and they were given coarse burlap robes. Every person was required to confess, not just the sins that drove them to the camp, but every misdeed of their lives, down to the smallest transgression. Brother Cornelius would sit there with a big ledger, Hartwell recalled, his voice flat, almost mechanical, as if replaying the memory on a loop. He wrote down everything you said, and if he thought you were hiding something, Brother Jebediah would help you remember. Those hands of his could bring pain you can't imagine. These forced confessions could last for days or weeks, depending on how long it took to satisfy the brothers. Only after they were convinced every sin had been uncovered did the physical ordeal begin. It started with a 7-day fast, only water allowed, during which the penitent was forced to dig their own grave, a symbol of their spiritual death. The hunger was insignificant compared to what followed, Hartwell explained, his entire frame quivering as memories forced their way back. They named it the trial of fire. They used leather lashes stitched with jagged metal pieces. Every strike was meant to symbolize a particular sin being carved from the body, but the whipping stretched on endlessly, hours, sometimes even entire days. Yet the physical agony marked only the beginning. Hartwell recounted how penitents were forced into ritual burials, placed in the very graves they had dug, then smothered with soil until only their faces remained above ground. They were left there for unpredictable spans of time, minutes, hours, while the brothers stood above, praying and declaring that their spiritual deaths were accomplished. Not everyone came back, Hartwell breathed, his eyes gleaming with the terror of remembrance. Brother Malachi would stand at the edge of the pit and proclaim them fully purified. Said they'd been summoned straight to heaven, but I saw them as the dirt came down. There wasn't peace on their faces, only pure, frozen fear. What horrified investigators most about Hartwell's testimony was his account of those who died during these purifications. He explained that the brothers insisted death in the ritual was the highest blessing. They called it proof that a soul had been washed completely clean, so God had taken it directly to paradise. They held a special rite for the dead, Hartwell remembered. Brother Malachi would read from Scripture while Brother Jebediah covered the grave. Then they'd raise a wooden cross and inscribe the person's name on what they called the roll of the redeemed. They said those poor souls were the fortunate ones. They'd bypassed purgatory altogether. Authorities in Marshall dismissed Hartwell's story at first, branding it the ramblings of a man broken by guilt and frontier lunacy. No missing person reports existed, and the Damnation brothers carried flawless credentials. They possessed recommendation letters from churches throughout Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi, plus glowing testimonies from families who claimed their kin had been reborn through the brothers' ministry. Sheriff Tom Bradley, a practical lawman hardened by years of frontier violence, was openly doubtful. "The frontier's full of drifters hiding from their past," he told Pastor Matthews. "Sounds to me like Hartwell found religion the hard way and lost his mind over it. Some of these revival preachers can be fiery, but murder's a mighty serious charge without solid proof." The incident was quietly set aside, and within weeks, Hartwell himself vanished. Rumors swirled. Some said he'd headed west for California, others that he'd returned to Arkansas. Pastor Matthews, however, feared something darker. Still, without evidence, he was powerless. Meanwhile, the camps went on unchallenged, their fame spreading wider each passing season. Hartwell's disappearance proved to be only the first piece of a long, sinister pattern. As years passed, the legend of the Damnation family's miraculous transformations echoed far beyond Texas. They claimed to have saved more than 1,000 sinners, reshaping the most ruthless criminals into shining beacons of faith who ventured into the wildest corners of the frontier. Letters of praise arrived at newspapers across Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana, extolling the brothers' divine work and recounting stories of redemption. These testimonies followed an eerily uniform script. A sinner reached a camp, endured the purification, and re-emerged as an entirely different soul. Within weeks, the reborn believer would claim to feel called to mission work in distant lands, California, Oregon, the Rockies, or deep within tribal territory. Their final letters to family described overwhelming devotion and pleas for money to fund their holy missions, but attentive eyes noticed unsettling threads. The camps constantly relocated, never lingering more than half a year in one place. The brothers said they were merely obeying God's will to seek new sinners, but the shifting made it nearly impossible for already stretched frontier law enforcement to track their movements. Even worse were the accounts from families who sent troubled sons or daughters to the camps, then received letters saying their loved ones had been so spiritually reborn that they had set out on missions far away. None of those people were ever seen or heard from again. The brothers always offered tidy explanations, even forging letters to justify their absences. Mrs. Elalana Westbrook of New Orleans became one of the earliest to doubt their claims. Her son Thomas, a gambler drowning in debts, had entered a redemption camp near Shreveport in 1849 and promptly disappeared. At first, she received letters describing his newfound faith and his calling to bring the gospel to California. The words were personal enough to sound authentic. He even asked for money to support his holy journey. "I was overjoyed at first," Mrs. Westbrook later testified. Thomas had been on a dark path, and those letters sounded like hope. But the handwriting troubled me. It mimicked his style, yet something was off. The way he shaped certain letters, the unfamiliar turns of phrase. I began to suspect an imitation. When she hired a private investigator to trace Thomas in California, the truth unraveled. No churches or missions in the regions he named had ever heard of him. The addresses in the letters either didn't exist or belonged to people who knew nothing of any missionary named Thomas Westbrook. Stories like hers multiplied. Dr. Elizabeth Thornton, a traveling physician who treated several camp survivors, recognized a chilling pattern in their symptoms. They showed classic signs of profound trauma. She would later testify before a federal tribunal. Not the serenity of the redeemed, but the empty gaze of those who have stared into something unspeakable. The few who returned alive were indeed changed, but not in the godly way the brothers boasted. They spoke little, flinched at the smallest sound, and carried some dreadful knowledge they refused to voice. Most unnerving of all was their collective silence regarding their time at the camps, as though bound by a dreadful pact. Dr. Thornton kept careful notes on cases that deeply unsettled her. Jacob Miller, an ex-outlaw who had endured the so-called purification, displayed the same haunted symptoms she'd seen in war veterans scarred by atrocities. He would wake up screaming about the pit and the ascension rite, she wrote in her journal. When asked for more, he simply muttered that certain salvations cost too much. Another survivor, a woman named Sarah Colby, who had abandoned her children to enter prostitution and sought redemption, returned home a hollow fragment of herself. She'd sit for hours, silent, her sister Mary reported. When she whispered prayers, they weren't for forgiveness of her own sins. She begged God to pardon her for the things she'd witnessed. Perhaps the most revealing case was Reverend Peter Hawkins, a Methodist minister who had joined a camp not as a sinner, but as an observer. He had intended to learn their methods and bring revival techniques back to his congregation. Yet Hawkins emerged as broken as any of the penitents. There are evils that wear the face of righteousness, Hawkins confided to Dr. Thornton during one session. I went looking for divine inspiration. What I found tore at the roots of my faith. Those men are not messengers of God. They're something else entirely. Something that turns our deepest hunger for grace into a weapon. When pressed, Hawkins refused to offer specifics. He said the real purpose of the camps had nothing to do with salvation at all. It was about exploiting the vulnerable. And speaking the truth, he warned, would only endanger anyone who sought to expose them. Disappearances and shattered survivors kept surfacing through the 1850s and into the the chaos of the Civil War became a perfect smokescreen for the Damnation brothers. With populations uprooted and communication in disarray, it became effortless for souls to vanish without a trace. The conclusion of the war brought with it both unforeseen complications for the Damnation brothers and new openings for those determined to uncover the truth about their crimes. In the early spring of 1879, nearly a decade and a half after the guns fell silent, a young Texas Ranger named Captain James Morrison began examining a troubling wave of missing persons reports scattered across East Texas. Morrison was a precise, calculated man with a background in military intelligence, and he observed something that previous investigators had overlooked. A distinct and unsettling pattern of disappearances that followed the path of the redemption camps like a shadow creeping along the frontier. He had been assigned to the matter after Senator Charles Whitman of Louisiana submitted a formal complaint concerning the vanishing of his nephew, who had last been seen entering one of the Damnation camps situated near the Texas-Louisiana border. Unlike earlier efforts led by overburdened county sheriffs with limited reach, Morrison's position granted him both the resources and the authority to pursue a thorough, coordinated investigation across state lines. "There's something here that doesn't fit," Morrison wrote in his first official dispatch to Ranger headquarters in Austin. "In just the last 3 years, I've documented more than 60 disappearances tied directly to these camps. That doesn't even include earlier records or the cases in other states where the documentation is incomplete." His investigation took him across the frontier, interviewing dozens of grieving families whose loved ones had sought salvation and vanished. The stories shared striking similarities. A family member would go to a redemption camp to be cleansed of sin. For several weeks, letters would arrive describing an intense spiritual transformation. Then, without warning, the correspondence would end with a single message declaring a calling to spread the gospel in distant, remote territories. Morrison's suspicion deepened as he tried to confirm these missionary claims. Every letter mailed to the addresses provided was returned as undeliverable. Churches and missions in the territories where these so-called converts were supposedly working had no record of their arrival or service. More disturbing still, several of the glowing testimonial letters, allegedly written by families expressing gratitude, contained identical sentences, the same spelling errors, and even identical turns of phrase. "Someone is manufacturing these testimonies," Morrison concluded in a private memorandum to his commanding officer. "What remains to be determined is whether we're dealing with a scheme of fraud, abductions, or something far worse." His first real breakthrough came in Jefferson, Texas, inside a dim tavern thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of stale whiskey. There he encountered a man named Tobias Fletcher, a laborer whose slurred speech concealed a story so chilling it made the seasoned ranger's blood run cold. Fletcher claimed he had spent nearly 2 years in the mid-1870s working for the Damnation brothers as a gravedigger and general camp hand. "I thought I was serving the Lord," Fletcher whispered, clutching a half-empty bottle. his fingers trembling. Brother Malachi said I was chosen to help cleanse souls. But some of those graves, they weren't just for ceremony. Some never got dug up again. He'd pray over them, say another soul was saved for eternity. But I knew what was really buried in that dirt. According to Fletcher, his responsibilities extended well beyond preparing symbolic burial sites for purification rituals. He was also forced to help dispose of the bodies of those who ascended during the process. The brothers publicly claimed that anyone who died in the ritual had achieved total spiritual cleansing, that God had called them directly to paradise. But Fletcher had seen enough corpses to recognize the difference between divine calling and deliberate killing. The way Brother Jebediah used his hands, Fletcher muttered, his voice dropping almost to nothing. He said it was healing. But I saw what he did to people. He could keep a man alive for days, drawing out everything. Names, property, hidden money, family ties. And when they had squeezed out everything worth taking, that's when he finished them. Fletcher revealed to Morrison a coldly calculated operation. The brothers weren't just tormenting their victims. They were extracting every scrap of useful information about their finances, land holdings, relatives, and business affairs during the long tortures. Then they forged letters to families, posing as their redeemed kin, asking for money to support fabricated missionary efforts and giving convincing excuses for why they couldn't return home. The money never stopped, Fletcher muttered bitterly. Families sent funds for years, believing their sons and daughters were preaching in far-off places, never knowing their bodies were rotting in unmarked graves beneath the East Texas soil. When Morrison pressed him for the exact location of these burial sites, Fletcher's entire demeanor shifted. The false bravado born of drink evaporated, replaced by naked terror. His eyes darted around the tavern's shadowed corners as if expecting the brothers themselves to emerge from the darkness. "They've got eyes everywhere," he stammered, now suddenly very sober. "People who start digging too deep, those people vanish too. I shouldn't have said anything. God forgive me, I shouldn't have said nothing." Fletcher fled the tavern that same night and disappeared without a trace. Some whispered he'd made his way to California. Others swore he'd been found floating in the swamps near Caddo Lake. Morrison believed the latter. Still, the terrified man had given him enough information to narrow the search to a small, heavily forested region near the Louisiana line, where the Damnation brothers were rumored to be running their newest camp. The intelligence Fletcher provided was as valuable as it was horrifying. Armed with these revelations and a growing stack of hard evidence, Morrison resolved to act. He handpicked a small, trusted team of rangers and set out for the area around Caddo Lake, determined to expose the brothers' operation. Their route carried them through some of the most isolated, forbidding land in East Texas. Massive old-growth trees knitted together overhead, choking out the sunlight, while cypress swamps swallowed sound and seemed to close in on their narrow trail. Morrison's team consisted of 3 carefully chosen men: Sergeant Bill Crawford, a hardened veteran of the Indian Wars; Corporal Miguel Santos, a former vaquero whose unmatched skill at reading terrain made him an invaluable tracker; and Private David Thompson, a young sharpshooter known for his steady hand and keen eyesight. Each man was selected not only for his abilities but also for his absolute discretion. Morrison could not afford for word of the operation to leak. As the rangers neared the suspected site, they began noticing signs that set their nerves on edge. The woods were eerily still. Even the relentless swarms of insects common in the humid Texas lowlands were absent. The few settlers they encountered muttered warnings, speaking of cursed soil, where crops refused to grow and where travelers went missing without a trace. "It ain't natural. That place," rasped Ezekiel Marsh, an old trapper they met at a trading post outside Marshall. "Been walking these woods 30 years. Critters won't go near that patch of land. And the few that do, come back wrong, if they come back at all." Marsh's grim account echoed everything Morrison had heard from other witnesses. People described a stretch of forest where the trees twisted into unnatural shapes, and the usual sounds of wildlife fell away into an oppressive silence. Some blamed Indian burial grounds or spirits for the strangeness, but Morrison suspected a more earthly cause. The decay of buried corpses could easily warp the local ecosystem. They set up camp several miles from the reported location of the redemption site, intending to watch the Damnation brothers' movements before acting. Morrison's plan was deliberate: gather undeniable proof before making any confrontation. The brothers' religious status and widespread reputation for miraculous conversions would make conviction nearly impossible without overwhelming evidence. That first night, as the Rangers sat in silence beneath the moonless canopy, faint sounds drifted toward them through the still air, unmistakable proof that something in those woods was very, very wrong. Carried along the night wind from the direction of the camp came unmistakable echoes of human agony, screams, desperate pleas, and a strange cadence of religious chanting in languages none of the men could identify. This wasn't the cry of someone simply in pain, as Morrison would later record in his official report. It was the sound of a soul in absolute torment, begging for a mercy that would never arrive. The most chilling element was its rhythm. The cries would halt without warning, only to resume hours later, as though the suffering itself was being meticulously extended. The wails persisted throughout the night, at times joined by the gritty scrape of digging and the muffled cadence of what seemed to be a ritual ceremony. When morning finally bled over the tree line, Morrison and his men steeled themselves for a preliminary reconnaissance of the area. What they uncovered in the dense woods surrounding the camp shattered their understanding of the Damnation family's crimes. Fresh graves stretched across the clearing like a grotesque garden, far too many to be explained away as symbolic gestures of faith. Morrison counted over 60, each marked with a crude wooden cross and a single number carved into its grain. But it was the stench that drove the truth home. No amount of soil or lime could disguise the rancid odor of decay clinging to the humid air. Private Thompson, who had served as a battlefield medic during the Indian conflicts, confirmed Morrison's unspoken fears. "That's the smell of a lot of bodies, Captain," he muttered grimly. "Fresh and old. This has been going on a long time." As the Rangers crept closer to the camp's center, new sounds froze their blood. From the largest tent came the steady, sickening rhythm of metal striking flesh, overlaid by a man's ragged screaming and the steady murmur of ritualistic incantations. The voice delivering the prayers was calm, almost conversational, its serenity amplifying the horror of the victim's agony. Morrison realized they were witnessing an ongoing torture ritual, likely the purification process Fletcher had described. The captain faced a brutal choice: storm the camp immediately and risk losing crucial evidence, or allow the cruelty to continue while gathering intelligence. But the choice was made for him. The screaming cut off abruptly, replaced by a silence so deep it was worse than the noise. Morrison knew then that a life had just been extinguished. Their mission had shifted, no longer a rescue but a fight to stop future atrocities. Through hand signals, Morrison positioned his men around the perimeter. Over the following hours, they recorded what would later form the backbone of one of the most consequential criminal prosecutions in frontier history. The brothers ran their camp with the precision of a seasoned enterprise. Their days followed a regimented schedule, evidence of years spent refining their methods. What the Rangers observed peeled back layer after layer of criminal sophistication, each revelation more disturbing than the last. Every morning began with what appeared to be a legitimate religious service: hymns, scripture readings, prayers. New arrivals participated eagerly, likely believing they'd found genuine salvation. But as daylight deepened, the pious facade fractured. Counseling sessions began, during which Brother Cornelius extracted intimate confessions from the penitents. These interrogations often stretched for hours, the Rangers hearing frantic pleas from behind the confession tent's canvas. "Brother Cornelius has a gift for knowing what people hide," Morrison noted in his surveillance log. "But I suspect that gift comes not from divine insight, but from methodical psychological torture." The brothers weren't merely seeking repentance. They were collecting detailed intelligence, bank accounts, property deeds, family connections, anything that could be exploited. They used this information to forge convincing letters to relatives, maintaining the illusion of the victim's survival for months or even years after their deaths. Meanwhile, Private Thompson, posted nearest the tents, observed Brother Jebediah's so-called healing sessions. They were torture rituals, crafted to break bodies and spirits. "He's got tools that'd make the Spanish Inquisition proud," Thompson whispered during a night briefing. "And he knows exactly how to use them, to keep a man alive through hell." The brothers' cruelty was not chaotic. It was engineered. Their system for interrogation, forgery, and disposal was clearly the product of many years of refinement. This camp bore every mark of an operation that had been repeated dozens of times. On their second night, the Rangers bore witness to what the brothers called the ceremony of ascension, their euphemism for murder. A penitent, barely clinging to consciousness after days of torment, was dragged to the center of camp. Brother Malachi delivered a long sermon extolling the purity of release. Brother Jebediah then ended the victim's suffering with cold, calculated efficiency. "This isn't religious frenzy," Morrison later wrote. "This is premeditated, structured murder, conducted like a business transaction, wrapped in the veil of faith." The corpse was buried in one of the numbered graves. Brother Malachi meticulously logged the ascension in a leather-bound ledger, revealing the ritual's systematic repetition over decades. But the Rangers uncovered more than murder. In a concealed workshop beyond the graves, they found evidence of a sprawling criminal network. Forged documents, counterfeit money, and elaborate fraud schemes reaching across state lines. "We're not just dealing with killers," Morrison concluded grimly. "This is one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in American history, using religion as both shield and sword." On the third day, their covert mission abruptly shifted. A family of 4, 2 parents and 2 young children, arrived seeking purification for minor moral failings. Morrison knew he could wait no longer. "I couldn't stand by and let children walk into that nightmare," he later told his superiors. "We had enough to prove their guilt. It was time to act." The plan was to apprehend the brothers during their evening service, when all 3 would be together and exposed. But the Damnation family was prepared. As the Rangers advanced, they encountered not just the brothers but a cadre of heavily armed accomplices masquerading as camp laborers. The firefight that followed lasted nearly an hour. 2 accomplices were killed, Sergeant Crawford was wounded, and chaos engulfed the camp. To the Rangers' horror, some of the penitents, so psychologically shattered they could no longer think for themselves, threw themselves between the gunmen and the lawmen, crying out that the brothers were their saviors. "They begged us not to hurt them," Thompson reported. "They thought we were demons trying to stop their salvation." I'll never forget it. The brothers themselves proved deadly adversaries. Brother Malachi was a skilled marksman with the precision of a man who'd seen combat. Brother Jebediah's sheer size and brute strength made him lethal, even unarmed. The confrontation had only just begun, and Morrison understood then that this would not end without blood. Brother Cornelius, though lacking the physical intimidation of his siblings, possessed a chilling talent for psychological manipulation. Even amid the chaos of gunfire, he employed unsettling tactics to disorient the Rangers, turning their fear into a weapon against them. The pivotal moment came when Morrison forced his way into the tent where the brothers kept their records. Inside, he uncovered more than simple bookkeeping. There were exhaustive accounts of their crimes and irrefutable proof of their true identities. The name Damnation was nothing but a carefully chosen mask. In reality, they were the Blackwood family, fugitives wanted for murder and fraud in Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Every element of their supposed faith, their names, credentials, testimonials, was fabricated to shield their criminal empire. They weren't zealots. They were seasoned predators who had weaponized religion to hide in plain sight. With their identities exposed, and their meticulously kept records now in the hands of law enforcement, the brothers' resolve began to fracture. One by one they were subdued, though not before Brother Cornelius made a desperate final move. He seized one of the child victims, dragging him close as a living shield in a last-ditch escape attempt. The standoff that followed peeled away any remaining illusion of moral conviction. When Morrison tried to negotiate, Brother Cornelius, utterly calm, explained that the boy had already been marked for purification and that killing him would be an act of mercy. "You don't understand what we offer," he said coldly. "These people come to us broken, sinful, without worth. We give them purpose. Death during purification is the greatest gift we can bestow. Private Thompson ended the confrontation with a precise shot, wounding Cornelius and sparing the child. The remaining accomplices, realizing their cause was lost, surrendered without resistance. With the brothers finally in custody, Morrison's team began the grim work of uncovering the true magnitude of their crimes. What they unearthed over the following hours and days surpassed their darkest suspicions. Their records were meticulous, almost obsessively so. Ledger after ledger chronicled more than 400 victims. Names, backgrounds, details of their torture and execution, and the exact sums extorted from their families through forged correspondence. The entries revealed that the brothers had been operating since at least 1843, 2 years before their arrival in Texas. They kept records like businessmen, Morrison reported. Every victim was numbered. They tracked everything, how much they stole, what they learned, and which torture methods worked best. It's the coldest, most systematic approach to murder I've ever seen. The physical evidence only deepened the horror. Excavation of the numbered graves revealed the remains of nearly 200 individuals, all bearing clear signs of prolonged torture before death. The victims spanned all ages, teenagers to the elderly, and came from every walk of life. Forensic examinations were conducted by Dr. Elizabeth Thornton and a team of medical experts from Austin and New Orleans. Their findings revealed not only the brutality of the methods but their precision. The brothers had studied anatomy and pain with methodical intent. Their techniques were crafted to maximize suffering while prolonging life, Dr. Thornton reported. Even more disturbing was evidence that they had been experimenting with various torture methods over extended periods, refining their techniques as though conducting research. Victims bore the marks of multiple methods, suggesting the brothers had turned human agony into a laboratory for cruelty. This wasn't just about money or information, Morrison concluded grimly. They took pleasure in the suffering itself. Their religion was a mask for their sadism. The workshop uncovered earlier contained even more damning evidence. Alongside document forgery tools were printing plates for counterfeit currency, stolen religious artifacts repurposed into torture instruments, and maps marking the locations of other camps. Perhaps most chilling was a handwritten manual authored by Brother Malachi himself. It detailed strategies for identifying and manipulating vulnerable individuals, psychological profiles, trust-building tactics, and step-by-step procedures to extract the maximum value from each victim before killing them. They turned human exploitation into a science, Dr. Thornton observed after studying it. Every aspect of their operation was optimized, for profit, for control, for cruelty. The scope of their network became unmistakable when investigators examined their correspondence. The brothers weren't lone predators. They were part of a sprawling criminal organization. Forgers, con artists, and even corrupt law enforcement officers were tied to their scheme. Bribes had bought silence. Their crimes stretched far beyond this single camp. As news of their capture spread, letters and testimonies began flooding in from across the South, each adding another piece to the vast mosaic of horror. Mrs. Catherine Phillips of Mobile, Alabama, wrote to authorities describing how her husband disappeared in 1852 after attending a purification camp run by 3 brothers matching the Blackwood's description. "We received letters from Samuel for nearly 2 years," she wrote. "He said he was doing missionary work in California and asked for money. We sent more than $800 before the letters stopped." Similar stories surfaced from Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, and Indian Territory. In every case, the pattern was identical. The brothers would establish a camp in a remote area, operate for 6 to 12 months, and vanish, leaving behind only rumors of conversions and missionaries who never returned. The investigation revealed that the Blackwoods had skillfully exploited the fractured communication systems of the frontier. By moving frequently and selecting remote locations, they avoided detection and frustrated any attempts at coordination between jurisdictions. "They understood the weaknesses in our system better than most lawmen," Morrison wrote in his final report. "They picked places where sheriffs were overwhelmed or corrupt, then disappeared before anyone could act." The brothers had also secured protection through bribery, forging relationships with crooked officials who provided them with advance warnings of investigations. Several sheriffs, judges, and even preachers were implicated. men who had sold their authority to shield monsters. The financial magnitude of their fraud was staggering. Investigators estimated more than $50,000 had been extorted from victims. Families through their false missionary correspondence, a fortune in the 19th century, and a theft of more than just money. The psychological devastation they left behind stretched across states, leaving a legacy of grief that no ledger could quantify. Families throughout the South had spent years believing their loved ones were out in the world doing God's work, spreading the gospel and changing lives, only to be confronted with the horrific truth that most had been murdered within days or weeks of entering the camps. That revelation shattered not only individual households, but entire communities that had once taken pride in supporting what they believed to be righteous missionary efforts. It forced people to question how such monstrous evil could hide behind the mask of faith for so long. Could human beings truly commit such acts with cold precision? The Damnation brothers' crimes confronted society with unsettling questions about the very nature of human darkness. The evidence and the roar of public outrage set the stage for one of the most highly anticipated legal battles in frontier history. What followed would become one of Texas's most infamous trials. Each day, the courthouse overflowed with onlookers, newspaper correspondents, and grieving relatives who had journeyed from far and wide to witness justice. District Attorney Robert Maxwell spearheaded the prosecution, tasked with proving a decades-long string of atrocities that crossed multiple state lines and claimed hundreds of lives. Many witnesses were dead, their voices silenced, leaving behind only the brothers' own meticulous records to speak for them. "Gentlemen of the jury," Maxwell began in his opening statement, "you are about to confront evidence of crimes so depraved, so relentlessly methodical, that they will shake your faith in human nature itself. These men stood in pulpits claiming to serve God, but they served only their lust for power and gold." The defense, led by the respected attorney James Worthington, attempted to portray the brothers not as cold-blooded killers, but as men consumed by their faith, misguided zealots who had crossed the line out of excessive religious fervor. Worthington argued they had believed they were saving souls, and any deaths were tragic consequences of their misguided devotion. "My clients may have sinned through zeal," Worthington pleaded. "They may even be guilty of negligence, but they are not the calculating murderers the prosecution would have you believe." That fragile defense unraveled swiftly once the prosecution began presenting testimony from survivors, along with excerpts from the brothers' own ledgers and records. The overwhelming evidence of deliberate, organized cruelty left no room for the pretense of religious intent. The most damning blow came from the brothers themselves. Malachi, far from contrite, testified with unsettling pride about the precision of their operation and their ability to evade justice for decades. "We provided a service society needed but would not admit," he said coolly. "The frontier is full of broken people, without purpose, without worth. We gave their meaningless lives value by allowing them to contribute to something greater." When asked to explain the murders, he answered without hesitation, "Death comes for all. We merely ensured theirs served a purpose." Cornelius showed no remorse either, describing with clinical detachment how he manipulated victims to extract confessions and financial secrets, as though he were lecturing on business strategy rather than recounting torture. "People want to confess," he said. "Guilt eats at them. I simply helped them find their truth." Jebediah's testimony was perhaps the most chilling of all. With unnerving enthusiasm, he spoke of pain as a tool of revelation. "Pain is a teacher," he declared. "It strips away the lies. My hands were blessed with the skill to apply just enough to break the soul without breaking the body." The prosecution reinforced this chilling testimony with the expert analysis of Dr. Elizabeth Thornton, who testified that the injuries showed advanced knowledge of anatomy and psychology. "These were not acts of misguided faith," she told the court. "This was systematic, deliberate cruelty executed with expert precision." Then came the survivors, the few who had endured the camps and lived to tell their stories. Samuel Hartwell, the cattle driver whose early testimony in 1847 had first raised alarm, described the purification process in halting, broken words. "They didn't just want to kill us," he said softly. They wanted to destroy us first, mind, body, and spirit. The torture wasn't to get information. It was because they liked it. Rebecca Marsh, a former prostitute who had survived 3 weeks inside the camp, explained how the brothers twisted faith to break their captives. They convinced you your pain was holy, she said. They made you grateful for the suffering. By the time they were done, death felt like mercy. Jacob Wheeler, a former accomplice turned witness, revealed the inner workings of their criminal machine. He described pre-planned operating timelines, carefully mapped escape routes, and contingency plans for evading law enforcement. They saw the westward expansion as opportunity, he said grimly. All those desperate people heading west with money and no one to look for them if they vanished. The courtroom gasped when the prosecution exposed the brothers' real identities and long criminal history. Records from Arkansas revealed their true names: Jacob, Cornelius, and Josiah Blackwood, fugitives wanted since 1841 for murder and fraud. They had started as conmen in Little Rock, killing their first victim, a merchant, when their schemes were uncovered. Then they fled west, stole the credentials of dead ministers from a burned church, and built their false religious identities from the ashes. Every prayer they led, every sermon they preached, Maxwell told the jury, was a lie crafted to conceal blood on their hands. Even more shocking, evidence revealed that Jebediah Damnation wasn't even related to the others. DNA testing and military records identified him as Walter Grimm, a disgraced soldier expelled from the army for torturing prisoners during the Mexican War. Together, these men had crafted one of the most elaborate and sinister criminal enterprises of the century, hiding beneath the holy trappings of missionary work while committing acts of unimaginable cruelty. The illusion had finally been stripped away. Walter Grimm had joined the Blackwood brothers in the late 1840s and proved so essential to their operations that they folded him into their fabricated family identity. His skill and brutality elevated their already dangerous enterprise into something far more efficient. After less than 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts for all 3 men. The evidence was overwhelming, the crimes beyond comprehension. There was never any real chance of an acquittal. Judge Harrison Caldwell, a stern and seasoned jurist who had presided over some of the harshest frontier justice cases, delivered sentences that reflected the unprecedented magnitude of their atrocities. "In my 30 years on the bench," Caldwell declared, his voice echoing through the silent courtroom, "I have never confronted evil so meticulously constructed, so calculated in its cruelty. Your crimes are not merely murder and fraud. They are a deliberate assault on the very foundations of civilized society." Jacob Blackwood, known as Brother Malachi, received a death sentence by hanging for 17 counts of first-degree murder. Cornelius Blackwood, called Brother Cornelius, was condemned to die for 12 counts of murder, along with multiple counts of fraud and torture. Walter Grimm, Brother Jebediah, was sentenced to death for 23 murders, the most confirmed victims of the 3. The executions took place on November 15, 1882, before a crowd of over 2,000 people who had traveled from across Texas and neighboring states to witness justice carried out. Even at the gallows, none of the men expressed an ounce of remorse. Jacob Blackwood's final words were as arrogant as his courtroom testimony. "We gave meaning to meaningless lives and purpose to purposeless deaths. History will vindicate our methods, even if your age is too blind to understand." Walter Grimm spoke last, and his chilling declaration left the crowd in uneasy silence. "There are others like us out there. We were not special, just more successful. The frontier breeds predators, and there will always be those who know how to feed on the desperate and the damned." The Damnation case became a watershed moment in frontier law enforcement. In its aftermath, stricter regulations were imposed on religious groups operating in isolated areas, and cooperation between state agencies increased to close the gaps the brothers had exploited. The trial also exposed how vulnerable remote communities were, highlighting the urgent need for stronger communication networks to track criminals across jurisdictions. Dr. Elizabeth Thornton, whose forensic testimony had been pivotal, used the case as the basis for one of the earliest studies in criminal psychology, examining how systematic predators select and manipulate their victims. Her work laid the groundwork for modern profiling and victim advocacy initiatives. The brothers' crimes left devastating economic ripples. Families across the South who had faithfully sent money to what they believed were missionary efforts were left destitute. Communities that had prided themselves on supporting evangelical work discovered their generosity had been funding torture and mass murder. Captain James Morrison, who had led the investigation that finally brought the brothers down, was promoted to major and tasked with forming a new multi-state task force dedicated to pursuing organized criminal groups. His investigative model became a cornerstone for handling complex frontier crimes for decades to come. The camps once operated by the Damnation family were abandoned, avoided for generations. Locals whispered that the ground itself was cursed, poisoned by the unspeakable acts committed there. More than a century later, the remote woods of East Texas still carry ghost stories of souls who sought redemption but found only horror. The tale of the Damnation family forces a hard look at the darkness humans are capable of. Not only their cruelty, but also the systems that allow predators to thrive. Their crimes did not flourish in isolation. They succeeded because they understood how to exploit weaknesses in frontier society, fragmented jurisdictions, inadequate communication, the indifference toward the disappearances of society's most vulnerable, and the naive belief that anything wrapped in the language of faith must be good. They weaponized society's purest impulses, faith, hope, the longing for redemption, turning them into tools of control and destruction. Perhaps the most chilling truth is that the Damnation brothers were not aberrations, but products of an environment that allowed their kind to exist. The frontier's vast isolation, its atmosphere of desperation, and its patchwork law enforcement created the perfect conditions for predators. Their story stands as a warning carved into the historical record. Evil often arrives not as a monster in the dark, but cloaked in righteousness, speaking the language of salvation. In every era, there are those willing to exploit trust, faith, and desperation for their own ends. The Damnation brothers claimed to offer redemption to the lost. Instead, they became the embodiment of damnation itself, leaving behind not sermons or hymns, but unmarked graves scattered across the American frontier. Their legacy is a permanent reminder of how fragile trust can be, and how darkness often hides behind the mask of light.